The woman in white. I never did tell Caden what happened to me on Main Street that day. Not that I had many occasions to. Mom and I moved 3 weeks later. We found ourselves in yet another smallish, oldish town, full of people who'd lived there most of their lives. A lot of those places around, I guess. This one was called Wheeler, which was a very boring name for a town, as far as I was concerned. There was a main street in Wheeler, but no dollar theater. No theater at all. It had been 10 months to the day since I'd seen Dad. At first, I thought he was just busy, but I'd quickly come to realize that the man wanted nothing to do with me. I spent a long time angry about it, but when Mom let slip to me, years later, that he wasn't my real dad, a part of me understood. Mom had been drunk when she told me. She'd first taken to drinking in Wheeler, even on the day we moved into our sprawling, decrepit new rental, which had once functioned as a sort of hospice care facility before being remodeled. I'd had to unload most of the U-Haul with Derek, some weird guy she'd found to help us move, while Mom sipped wine from a steadily replenishing glass and slurred instructions on where to put down boxes. There had been a lot of weird guys around, ever since we'd moved to Wheeler. But these sorts of things sail over a 9-year-old's head, and so for me, life in Wheeler went back to a close approximation of normal. I started at a new school, made new friends, and Grandma even drove up for dinner on Sunday nights. On one of those nights, she tottered up our driveway struggling with a large container. I rushed out the front door to help her. "What's this?" I asked, reaching to take the container, a large crate, from her. She didn't need to answer. A small yip from inside the crate announced the arrival of Chuck, a 10-week-old Siberian husky who I immediately loved with my whole heart. Chuck wasn't a substitute for a dad, but he was something that kept me busy, and maybe that's all you need, in the end. I fed Chuck, trained him, took him on runs, and cleaned all his poop. I gave him baths, clipped his nails, and kept an eye out for any health problems. When necessary, I scheduled veterinary appointments myself. In return, he gave me undying loyalty and the sort of starstruck, giddy love only a puppy can manage. There was just one tiny problem. Chuck didn't like the house. Or, at least, he didn't like certain parts of the house. I couldn't figure it out. He'd get on my bed, but never the guest bed. He'd whine warily at one random place on the kitchen floor. And he wouldn't go inside my mom's bedroom at all. At first, I thought it was just a weird personality quirk. It wasn't until one day in the fall of 2011 that I realized it might be something else entirely. I'd just gotten home from school, 5th grade, now, and Chuck greeted me at the door with sloppy kisses. I set my backpack down, got myself a glass of iced water from the fridge, and walked up the stairs, Chuck keeping pace at my side. As I turned down the long upstairs hallway toward my bedroom, though, Chuck stopped in his tracks, whimpering softly. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked. He just sat on his hind legs, staring intently at the closed door right next to my bedroom, the guest room. "Yeah, I know you don't like it in there," I said with a shrug. I took another couple of steps toward my bedroom when Chuck started to growl. He never growled. I looked back at him, eyebrows raised. He was more alert than I'd ever seen him. Something was wrong. I must have stared at that door for a solid minute. "Mom?" I eventually called out, my voice a bit muted, hesitant to make too loud a noise. I didn't know whether or not she was home. I'd given up trying to figure out her schedule. Chuck took a careful step towards the guest room door, then immediately retreated. My heart was thumping in my throat. I took a deep breath, then, with a clamming palm, I opened the guest room door and looked inside. But it wasn't the guest room at all. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was the same room. Same ceiling, the same window, and the same notch in the far wall. But, it was different. A ghastly papering of cream and teal stripes, totally unfamiliar, lined the walls. The bed, which sat right where the guest bed had, was old-looking, with a painted metal frame and clean white linens. The only thing that seemed out of place was an ominous dark stain on the floor beside the bed. This wasn't quite the same as that long-ago day in the park, or what I'd seen outside the sticky shoe more than 2 years earlier. But it felt similar. I was glimpsing something, a memory, I just wasn't enveloped in it. Yet. But that was coming, I could tell, like a torturous sneeze that just wouldn't, woof. One sharp, devastatingly loud bark from Chuck snapped me back to my senses. My chest heaved, and my hands shook. I looked around. It was the guest room again, through and through. Navy blue wallpaper. My parents' old bed. A small brown dresser my grandma had given us years earlier. Yep. The guest room. Same as always. Only now, I couldn't help wondering. What happened here? That question had an answer, and it was more noxious and foul than I could have imagined. I wouldn't begin to learn it for another 10 months. July 2012. I remember the date so well because Wheeler had gotten a brand new, state-of-the-art movie theater, but I'd been scared to go. A shooting in a Colorado theater had just shocked the nation. I had begun to think more deeply about the things I had seen. The deaths I'd seemingly experienced, albeit through another's eyes. Why had these visions come to me? Why had I been granted this terrifying, macabre privilege? Surely there was a reason, and I determined that it was up to me to discover it. And so it was that I resolved to spend a night, not in my bed, but on the old, lumpy mattress in the guest room next door. I began the evening more melodramatically than I now care to admit, lighting candles and chanting the only Latin words I knew, E pluribus unum. I briefly considered sprinkling salt on the floor, but I knew I'd never get it out of the cracks in the hardwood. Still, with only a few horror movies under my belt, I'd managed to throw together a perfectly respectable seance, and I hoped that it would set a nice mood for any ghosts who wanted to show me how they died. I went to bed disappointed, drifting away in the wee hours of the morning, having spent a thoroughly boring night staring at the moonlight reflected against the notch on the wall. I woke briefly, before it was light out, and was at first confused why the window was on the wrong side of the room. Then I remembered that I was in the guest room, and made to rub my eyes, and I was jarred fully awake by the sight of my saggy, wrinkled, liver-splotched hand. I attempted to sit bolt upright, but received a sharp pain in my spine for my trouble, and scarcely moved an inch. I felt so tired, almost dead. But there was no fear of the end, only a resigned, reluctant acceptance. The party had grown stale, it was almost time to leave. Death had already come for my parents, my husband, and my old friends. I could be no different. So why were my palms sweating? Why was my weak, decrepit heart pounding against my ribcage in desperation? I was scared, terrified, even, but of what, I did not know. I just couldn't remember. The doorknob turned with a creak, and the door swung open, and in walked the devil herself. The one who frightened me, even when death did not. The woman in white. "Hello, Dorothy," she said. A light smile graced her beautiful lips. Why did she have to be beautiful? It would somehow be easier if she were not. I turned my head, slightly, to see what she wheeled in behind her. A cart, with a tray on top. On the tray were various needles, formulas, and units of serrated, violent-looking surgical equipment. What would she do with them? I could not remember everything, but I remembered the screams. The screams of all the others. "No," I croaked. "No, please." There, Dorothy," the woman in white crooned. She closed the door behind her, and the lock clicked with finality. "This will only hurt for a while. I suppose we've reached the part of the story where I tell you about Mrs. Vance. Ms. Vance was my 8th grade history teacher. Most of the students liked her a lot. I never did, and for a long time, it was a complete mystery why. She was nice, funny, and cared about her job. Though middle-aged, she was also exceptionally pretty, in a way that sometimes made it hard to focus on what she was saying. We'd spent most of the year in her class talking about the history of our state, but it recently turned toward family history, and how it was a kind of history we could all easily accessible. We were encouraged to talk to our parents, and our grandparents, and learn as much as we could about our genealogy. The final project was to present our findings to the class. To demonstrate, Mrs. Vance prepared a presentation about her family history. She began by talking about herself, how she'd grown up in Wheeler, been raised by a single mother, and never married, though she did have a son who was grown up and living far away. The slide flipped from a picture of her child to a picture of her father, from modern-day color to an old-timey sepia. "Unfortunately, I never really knew my dad," she said, and there was clear regret in her voice. "He disappeared when I was very, very young. He might have run away, something might have happened to him, we'll probably never know. But, I suppose every family has a few mysteries." She cleared her throat. "My mother, Edith, however, the real Miss Vance, as I like to call her, still lives in Wheeler to this day. Though, she's a very old lady now." The picture on the slideshow changed once more, and I audibly gasped as a woman, movie star beautiful, appeared on the classroom screen, smiling sweetly and dressed in a medical uniform. White, of course. A few kids turned to look at me, and I did my best to turn my gasp into a cough. I barely even registered as Miss Vance gushed about her mother, who had been an administrator and hospice nurse at the Halliburton Home, a local facility where elderly people would go to live out their final days. I was too numb with shock to notice much of anything besides the photograph, taken in a building that was now my home, of a woman whom I knew to be an unaliver. I had begun to think of my visions as marks, left unwittingly by terrible deaths. I had no idea why I could see them, or what I was supposed to do about them. But I knew one thing for certain. Edith Vance was the vilest woman who had ever been born. I had learned to live with the memory, not even mine, of falling from that tree in the park. The smell of gasoline, as it singed someone else's nostrils outside a theater that would one day be known as the Sticky Shoe. But those were nothing, compared to what had happened to the poor woman called Dorothy on the night that the woman in white walked into her room. The former, I remembered. The latter I could never forget. It hadn't been an isolated case, either. Dorothy had known to fear her. Recalled the screams of the others, even as her mind was fading and she could recall little else. How many others had there been? I sat on this question, and on the identity of the woman in white, for nearly 3 years. I simply didn't know what to do. At least, not until the day Mom finally got the pantry door unstuck.